I told him I fell. I lied. The words echoed in my head as I pushed open the glass door to Rossetti's, the soft chime above it far too cheerful for a night like this, and for a second I just stood there, letting the warmth of the restaurant hit my skin while the cold from outside still clung to my bones, my reflection faint in the polished brass frame, hair tied back too tight, foundation layered just enough to hide what I didn't want questions about, or maybe just enough to delay them. I adjusted the sleeve of my uniform again, tugging it down over my wrist even though it was already long enough, even though no one had noticed yet, even though I could still feel the ghost of fingers there from 2 nights ago, like a memory my skin refused to forget, and I forced a breath in, slow, steady, the way I'd practiced in the bathroom mirror before my shift, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself you're fine. "You're late, Hannah," Marco called from behind the bar, not unkind, just tired, like everyone here after a Friday rush that hadn't even started yet, and I gave him a quick nod, slipping past tables dressed in white linen and low candlelight, the kind of place where people wore watches worth more than my car and talked about deals like they were ordering dessert, the kind of place where no one looked too closely at the staff unless something went wrong. I grabbed my tray, fingers steady enough if I didn't think about it, and started my routine, water glasses, menus, polite smiles, each movement rehearsed, automatic, safe, because routine meant no surprises, and no surprises meant I could get through the night without anyone asking why I flinched when someone moved too fast or why I kept my distance just a little more than necessary. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket, sharp and sudden, and my stomach dropped before I even checked it because I already knew, I always knew, and sure enough the screen lit up with his name, one message, simple, controlled, the way he liked it, "Don't embarrass me tonight." I locked the screen without replying, sliding the phone back like it burned, my chest tightening as I forced another breath, because I couldn't afford to think about him here, not now. Not with a full dining room and 8 tables assigned to me, not when I needed every tip I could get. The front door opened again, a subtle shift in the air more than a sound, and I didn't look up at first, didn't need to, because places like this had a rhythm, a pattern of arrivals and departures, but then the room changed, conversations dipping just slightly, heads turning in that almost imperceptible way people do when someone important walks in, and I felt it before I saw him, that quiet pull of attention. Like gravity had shifted a few degrees off center. When I finally glanced toward the entrance, it was instinct, nothing more, just another customer, another table, except he wasn't just another anything, and the moment my eyes landed on him, I forgot to breathe. He moved without hurry, dark suit cut perfectly, posture relaxed but precise, like every step had already been decided before he took it, and the men with him, 3, maybe 4, kept just enough distance to make it clear he was the center without needing to say it, and I didn't know his name yet, didn't know anything about him, but I knew exactly what he was, the same way you know when a storm is coming before the sky changes. Something in the air, something in your chest. I looked away too quickly, focusing on the tray in my hands, on the clink of glass against glass, on anything that wasn't the way my pulse had suddenly picked up for reasons I couldn't explain, and I told myself it didn't matter, that he was just another customer, that I'd serve his table like any other and move on, that tonight would be quiet, uneventful, forgettable, because that's what I needed, that's what I always needed, a night where nothing happened. I didn't notice him watching me until it was too late, until I felt it, that steady, deliberate attention like a hand at my back, guiding, waiting, and when I turned just slightly, just enough to confirm it, his gaze was already there, locked on me like he'd been expecting me to look, like he'd been waiting for that exact moment, and something inside me went still, completely. The noise of the restaurant fading to a distant hum as my fingers tightened around the tray and one thought slipped through everything else. Quiet and certain in a way that didn't make sense yet, I should walk away. I didn't. I should have walked away, but instead I turned back to my section, forcing my feet to move like nothing had changed, like my pulse was not suddenly too loud in my ears, like his eyes had not just pinned me in place for a fraction of a second that felt far longer than it should have, and I told myself it was nothing, just another man with money and presence, the kind this place attracted every night. Except my hands did not believe me because they tightened around the tray just a little too much, enough for the glassware to clink softly, enough for me to notice, enough for me to take another slow breath and steady myself before heading toward table 12 where Marco had already set them, the best table in the room, of course, and I did not need to look up to know he would be there, but I did anyway, because something in me needed to confirm it, needed to know I had not imagined the weight of that gaze, and there he was, seated at the head like it had always belonged to him, one arm resting casually along the back of the chair, the other near a glass of water he had not touched yet, his expression unreadable but his attention unmistakably fixed on me the second I stepped closer. I focused on the basics, on the script I had repeated 1,000 times. Good evening, welcome in, can I start you with something to drink? My voice steady enough that no one would hear the slight hesitation underneath, no one except maybe him, because his eyes did not leave my face as I spoke, not in a way that felt careless or distracted, but deliberate, like he was studying something specific, something he had already decided mattered. His associates ordered first, wine selections I did not need to write down because I had memorized the list weeks ago, and I nodded, repeated it back, kept everything smooth, efficient, invisible, the way you survive in a place like this, and then it was his turn, and for a moment there was silence, just long enough for me to feel it stretch, just long enough for me to become aware of how close I was standing. How easily I could step back, how I did not. Water is fine, he said finally, his voice low and controlled, the kind that did not need to be loud to be heard, and I realized then that I had been holding my breath again because it left me in a quiet rush as I nodded and reached for his glass, careful, precise, focused on the simple act of pouring, because simple things were safe, predictable, manageable. It should have been easy, just another movement in a long shift, but the moment I set the pitcher down, my sleeve shifted, barely an inch, just enough for cool air to touch skin that had not seen light all night, and I reacted without thinking, tugging it back down too quickly, too obviously, the kind of movement that draws attention instead of hiding it, and I felt it immediately, the shift in him, subtle but undeniable, like something had clicked into place behind those steady eyes. I told myself to move on, to step back, to finish the table and leave, but as I turned, my tray caught the edge of the table just slightly, not enough to fall, not enough to make a scene, just enough to tilt the balance for a second that stretched too long, and then his hand was there, fast, controlled, closing around my wrist to steady me before anything could slip, before anything could break, and everything inside me went completely still. It was not rough, not even close, but it was firm, certain, the kind of grip that did not question itself, and for a second I forgot where I was, forgot the room, the noise, the low hum of conversations around us, because all I could feel was the warmth of his hand against my skin and the sudden, sharp awareness of the place I had tried so hard to hide. His fingers stilled, just for a fraction of a moment, and I knew he felt it, the slight unevenness beneath the fabric, the truth pressed into my skin no matter how carefully I had covered it, and my breath caught, shallow and quick, as I pulled back instinctively, not hard, just enough to create distance, enough to reclaim something that suddenly felt exposed. I am fine, I said quickly, too quickly, the words automatic, practiced, the same ones I had used before, the same ones I would use again if I had to, and I kept my eyes on the tray instead of his face because I did not want to see what I already knew would be there, that shift, that recognition, that quiet understanding that made everything more dangerous, not less. But silence answered me, not dismissal, not indifference, just silence that lingered long enough to make me look up despite myself, and when I did, his gaze had changed, not softer, not kinder, just sharper, more focused, like he had decided something without saying it out loud. You should be more careful, he said, the words simple, almost neutral, but there was something underneath them, something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, and I nodded again, because that was what I did, I nodded, I smiled, I moved on, because staying meant questions, and questions were the one thing I could not afford tonight. I stepped away from the table, each movement measured, controlled, but I could feel it, that attention still following me, still there even when I turned my back, like a presence that refused to fade, and for the first time since I had walked into the restaurant, I realized something that unsettled me more than it should have, more than anything else that night had so far, because it was quiet and certain and impossible to ignore, he had seen it, and he was not going to forget. I tried to forget about it, about the way his eyes had sharpened, about the brief moment his hand had closed around my wrist like he already knew something I had not said out loud, but forgetting was harder than it should have been because every time I moved through the dining room I could feel it again, that quiet, steady awareness, like he had marked a point in the room and that point was me, and no matter how many tables I served or how many times I turned away, it never quite faded. I focused on work, on orders and refills and the rhythm of plates moving in and out of the kitchen, because rhythm meant control, and control meant I could keep everything else contained, but even then my mind kept drifting back, replaying the exact second my sleeve had slipped, the exact look in his eyes when it did, and I hated that part the most, not that he had seen it, but that he had understood it without needing an explanation. My phone buzzed again, sharper this time, more insistent, and I felt it before I even checked, that familiar drop in my stomach, that tightening in my chest, and I told myself to ignore it, to finish the tray in my hands first, but it buzzed again, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the low hum of the restaurant until I finally stepped into the service hallway, away from the tables, away from anyone who might hear. 3 missed calls. 1 new message. Answer me. I stared at the screen for a second too long, my reflection faint in the black glass, eyes a little too tired, a little too careful, and then I typed back quickly, keeping it short, neutral, safe. I am working, I will call you later, because anything else would take too long, anything else would turn into a conversation I could not have right now. The reply came almost instantly, like he had been waiting with the phone in his hand. Watching you is not that hard, you know. My breath caught, sharp and sudden, and I turned without thinking, looking back toward the dining room as if I could see him from here, as if the walls were not in the way, as if that sentence had not just pulled the ground out from under me in the quietest way possible. He was not here, I told myself. He could not be here. This place was too controlled, too visible, too far from the kind of spaces he preferred, but the message stayed on the screen, heavy, uncertain, and for a second I did not know what scared me more, the possibility that he meant it, or the possibility that he did not need to. Hannah, Marco called from the kitchen entrance, and I flinched before I could stop myself, locking my phone and slipping it back into my apron like nothing had happened, like my heart was not suddenly beating too fast again, like the air in the hallway had not turned thin and sharp. Table 12 is asking for you, he added, his tone casual, unaware, and I nodded quickly, forcing my feet to move, because staying here meant thinking, and thinking meant spiraling into something I could not control. When I stepped back into the dining room, everything looked the same low lighting, the same soft music, the same quiet conversations, but it felt different now, like something had shifted just beneath the surface, something I could not see but could definitely feel, and I knew before I even reached the table that it had something to do with him. He was still there, exactly where I had left him, posture unchanged, expression composed, but his attention was sharper now, more direct, like whatever he had noticed earlier had settled into something certain, something he was no longer questioning, and as I approached, I told myself to keep it professional, to keep it simple, to give them what they needed and leave again, because distance was the only thing that made sense. Can I get you anything else? I asked, my voice steady enough to pass, and his associates answered first, small requests, another bottle, a different side, things I could handle without thinking, things that did not matter, and then he spoke again, not looking at the menu, not looking at the table, just looking at me in that same deliberate way that made everything else feel secondary. Come here, he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, not a demand exactly, but not a suggestion either, and for a second I hesitated, just a fraction, just enough to feel it, that instinct to step back, to create space, to refuse something I did not understand, but my feet moved anyway, closing the distance before I had fully decided to. I stopped at the edge of the table, close enough to hear him clearly, far enough that it still felt safe, or at least safer, and I waited, because that was what the moment required. And for a second he said nothing, just studied my face like he was looking for something specific, something I had not given him yet. Then his gaze dropped, not slowly, not dramatically, just directly to my wrist where the fabric still sat too carefully, too deliberately, and I felt the heat rise under my skin even though nothing had changed on the surface, even though everything was still hidden, still controlled. That is not from a fall, he said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, just stating it. Like a fact that did not need proof, and my breath caught again, softer this time, more contained, because denial was the only response I had left, the only thing that kept everything else from unraveling. It is nothing, I said, the words automatic, practiced, the same ones that had worked before, the same ones that had to work now, because anything else would open a door I could not close. His eyes did not move from mine, and for a second the room seemed to shrink, the noise fading just enough for me to feel the weight of that silence between us, and then he leaned back slightly, not breaking the gaze, not letting it go, just shifting enough to make the next words land harder than they should have. I do not like liars, he said, still quiet, still controlled, and something about the way he said it made my chest tighten in a completely different way. Not fear exactly, not anger, something else I could not quite name, something that felt like being seen too clearly in a place where I had spent months trying to disappear, and before I could respond, before I could decide what to say or how to say it, he added, just as calm, just as certain, especially when they are hurt. And just like that, I realized this was not over, not even close. The words stayed between us longer than they should have, not loud, not dramatic, just there, settled into the space like something permanent, and I felt it in the way my fingers tightened slightly around the edge of my tray, in the way my breath came a little slower as I tried to keep everything controlled, because control was the only thing I had left in this moment, the only thing keeping me from reacting in a way I could not take back. I need to check on my other tables, I said, keeping my voice even, professional, giving him something normal to hold onto instead of the truth he was clearly waiting for. And for a second I thought he might stop me, might press further, but he did not. He just watched me with that same steady focus, like the conversation was not over, like it had simply been paused, and somehow that felt worse. I turned before I could hesitate, before I could look back again, and walked toward the kitchen with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one an effort not to rush, because rushing would show something, and I could not afford that, not here, not in front of him, not in front of anyone. The moment I pushed through the kitchen doors, the noise hit me all at once, orders being called, plates clattering, the familiar chaos that usually grounded me, but tonight it felt distant, like I was moving through it without really being part of it, my mind still caught in that quiet exchange at the table. "You okay?" Maria asked as she passed me, her voice low, concerned, and I forced a quick nod, the kind that ended the question before it could become something more, because explaining was not an option, not when I did not even fully understand what had just happened myself. I grabbed the next order, focusing on details, on timing, on anything that required enough attention to push everything else aside, but it did not work, not completely, because every time the kitchen doors swung open, I found myself glancing toward the dining room, toward that table, toward him, as if some part of me needed to confirm he was still there, that I had not imagined any of it. He was always there, exactly where I had left him, but something had changed, something subtle but unmistakable, because now he was not just observing, not just watching the room in that detached, controlled way, now his attention tracked me specifically, following each movement I made, each table I approached, each step I took, and it made the space feel smaller, tighter, like the distance between us did not matter as much as it should have. My phone buzzed again, sharp and sudden against my side, and I froze for a fraction of a second before forcing myself to move, to ignore it, to keep going, because I already knew what it was, and answering it here, now, would only make everything worse, but it buzzed again, longer this time, more insistent, and the sound cut through my concentration until I finally slipped into the narrow hallway near the restrooms, just far enough away to check without being seen. 2 missed calls. Another message. "You are not answering." That is not a good idea. My chest tightened, the words sitting heavy in a way that made the air feel thinner, and I stared at the screen for a moment, trying to decide, trying to calculate the safest response, the one that would keep everything from escalating, because that was always the goal, keep it calm, keep it contained, keep it from turning into something bigger than I could handle. I typed quickly, my fingers steady even if my thoughts were not. "I am working, I will call you after my shift," and hit send before I could second guess it, before I could change my mind, because hesitation only made things worse. For a second, nothing happened, just the quiet hum of the hallway, the distant noise of the restaurant beyond the door, and I allowed myself a small breath, a moment of stillness, but then the reply came, faster than it should have, like he had been waiting, watching, ready. "I can come there if you want me to." The words hit harder than they should have, not because they were loud or threatening, but because they were not, because they were calm, controlled, and that was always when things felt the most unpredictable. I locked the phone immediately, my heart beating too fast again, and for a second I just stood there, staring at nothing, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think, because I needed to decide what to do next before he decided for me. "Hannah!" The voice came from behind me, low, close, and I turned too quickly, the motion automatic, defensive, my pulse jumping again, and there he was, closer than he had been before, standing just inside the hallway like he had always belonged there, like the distance I had tried to create meant nothing at all. I had not heard him approach, had not seen him leave his table, and that realization settled into my chest in a way that felt both unsettling and strangely steady at the same time. "You should not be back here," I said, the words coming out softer than I intended, more uncertain, and he did not respond right away, just looked at me, at my face, at the way I was holding myself, like he was taking in everything at once, every detail I had tried to keep hidden. "He is calling you," he said finally, not a question, just a statement, and my stomach dropped because I had not told him that, had not shown him the screen, had not given him anything that should have led him to that conclusion, and yet he said it like he already knew, like it was obvious, like it was something he had already accounted for. I tightened my grip on my phone without meaning to, a small, unconscious movement, but his eyes caught it instantly, tracking it with the same precision as everything else, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us again, heavier now, more charged than before. "It is none of your business," I said, the words coming out more firmly this time, because I needed that line, needed something to hold on to, something that separated whatever this was from the rest of my life, from the parts of it I could not let anyone else touch. He did not react the way I expected, did not push, did not argue, just watched me for a moment longer, and then he stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd me, not enough to trap me, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional. "It became my business the moment I saw you trying to hide it," he said quietly, and something in his tone made my chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of it, from the certainty behind it, and before I could respond, before I could push back or walk away or do anything at all, he added, just as calm, just as controlled, "And I do not ignore things that matter." For a second, I forgot how to answer, forgot what the right response was supposed to be, because nothing about this felt simple anymore, nothing about this felt like something I could just walk away from, and standing there in that narrow hallway, with my phone still warm in my hand and his presence too close to ignore, I realized something I had not wanted to admit even to myself. This was not just about being seen anymore, it was about what he was going to do with it. For a moment, neither of us moved, the narrow hallway suddenly feeling too small, too quiet, like the world outside those walls had faded into something distant and unimportant, and I became acutely aware of everything at once, the faint hum of the overhead light, the cool tile beneath my shoes, the weight of my phone still in my hand, and him, standing just close enough that I could not ignore it, could not pretend this was just another conversation I could walk away from. "You do not know me," I said finally, the word steadier than I felt, because that was the truth I needed to hold on to, the line that separated whatever this was from everything else, from the parts of my life that were not his to see, not his to touch, not his to decide anything about. His expression did not change, not visibly, but there was something in his eyes, something sharper now, more certain, like he had already considered that argument and dismissed it before I even said it. "I know enough," he replied, his voice still low, still controlled, and somehow that made it worse, because there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just quiet certainty, and I felt something tighten in my chest again, something I could not quite name, something that made it harder to breathe evenly. My phone buzzed again, cutting through the moment like a sharp edge, and I flinched before I could stop myself, the reaction immediate, instinctive, and I hated that he saw it, hated that he noticed the way my fingers tightened around the device, the way my shoulders tensed just slightly, because it confirmed everything I had been trying to deny. "Answer it," he said, not as an order, not exactly, but close enough that it settled into the space between us like one, and I shook my head almost immediately, the motion small but firm. "No," I said, because answering would only make things worse, would pull this moment into something even more complicated, something I could not control, and control was already slipping through my fingers faster than I liked. He watched me for a second longer, then his gaze shifted briefly to the phone in my hand, then back to my face, like he was weighing something, calculating, deciding, and the silence stretched again, heavier this time, more charged, until he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own phone, the movement smooth, unhurried, like everything else about him. I did not understand what he was doing at first, not until he glanced down at the screen, tapped something quickly, and then looked back at me, his expression unchanged but his attention sharper than ever. "He will stop calling," he said simply, like it was already done, like it was not even a question, and for a second I just stared at him, the words not fully settling, not fully making sense, because that was not how things worked, that was not how anything worked in my world, where calls kept coming and messages kept appearing and silence was never something you could just decide into existence. You cannot just do that, I said, my voice quieter now, less certain, because part of me already knew he could, part of me had seen enough in the last few minutes to understand that the rules I was used to did not apply to him the same way, and that realization sat heavy in my chest, unsettling in a way I could not easily push aside. He did not argue, did not explain, just held my gaze for a moment longer, and then, as if on cue, my phone went still in my hand, the screen dark, the buzzing gone, the sudden silence louder than any sound had been before. I swallowed, my grip tightening unconsciously, and for the first time that night, I felt something shift in a way I could not ignore, not fear exactly, not relief either, something in between, something that felt like the ground beneath me was no longer entirely mine to stand on. Why are you doing this? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because I needed to understand, needed something to make sense in a situation that was quickly becoming anything but. He did not answer right away, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, and when he finally spoke, his voice was just as calm, just as controlled as before, but there was something deeper underneath it now, something that made the words land harder than they should have. Because I do not like seeing damage where it does not belong, he said, and the way he said it made my breath catch, not from fear, not from anything obvious, but from the weight of it, from the implication behind it, from the way it connected to everything he had already noticed, everything he had already decided without asking me for permission. I shook my head slightly, the motion more reflex than intention, because I did not know how to respond to that, did not know how to fit it into the version of my life I had been holding together piece by piece for so long. You should go back to your table, I said, falling back on something practical, something normal, because normal was easier to manage, easier to control, and for a second I thought he might refuse, might push further, but instead he stepped back, just enough to give me space, just enough to make it clear the decision was his to make, not mine. Finish your shift, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, and then, as if the conversation had never been anything more than a brief interruption, he turned and walked back toward the dining room, his presence receding but not disappearing, not really, because even as the distance grew, I could still feel it, that quiet certainty he carried with him, that sense of control that seemed to extend beyond the immediate space. I stood there for a moment longer, my phone still silent in my hand, my thoughts moving too fast to catch, too tangled to sort through, and I told myself this would end when the night ended, that whatever this was would stay contained within these walls, within this shift, within this moment, because that was the only way it made sense, the only way I could keep everything else from unraveling. But as I stepped back into the dining room, as my eyes instinctively found his table again, as his gaze lifted to meet mine without hesitation, I realized something that made my chest tighten all over again. This was not something that would stay where it started, and deep down, I already knew it. I kept moving because that was the only thing that made sense, one table to the next, one order to the next, the rhythm of the shift pulling me forward even when my mind kept trying to drift back to that hallway, to the way everything had shifted in a matter of minutes, to the quiet certainty in his voice when he said the calls would stop, and the way they actually had, like silence was something he could just decide into existence. It should not have unsettled me as much as it did, but it did, because silence had never been something I could rely on before, never something that lasted without a reason attached to it, and now it sat in my pocket, heavy and unfamiliar, making every step feel slightly off balance. I checked my phone twice in the next 10 minutes without meaning to, quick glances when no one was looking, expecting to see another message, another missed call, something that would bring everything back to the way it had been, but the screen stayed dark, unchanged, and each time it did, that strange, quiet feeling returned, not quite relief, not quite tension, something in between that I did not know how to process. Across the room, he remained exactly where he had been, his posture relaxed but deliberate, his attention no longer subtle, no longer something I could pretend not to notice, and every time I looked up, even by accident, his gaze was already there, steady, unhurried, like he was not watching the room anymore, like he was watching me. I told myself to ignore it, to focus on the job, to let the night pass the way it always did, but ignoring something like that was harder than it should have been, because it did not feel intrusive, not exactly, it felt intentional, like he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for everything else to fall into place around it. "You have that table again," Maria said quietly as she passed me another order, her tone light but her eyes curious, and I nodded without looking at her, because I knew which table she meant, because there was only one table that felt different tonight, one table that seemed to pull my attention no matter how hard I tried to keep it elsewhere. I approached slowly this time, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I was too aware of everything, of the space between us, of the way my movements might be read, of the way his eyes followed each step until I stopped at the edge of the table again, tray balanced carefully in my hands. "Your order," I said, keeping my voice even, setting down each plate with practiced precision, focusing on the details, on the placement, on anything that kept me from looking directly at him longer than necessary, but it did not matter, because I could feel it anyway, that quiet attention that did not waver, did not shift, did not give me the space I thought I needed. When I finished, I started to step back, the same way I always did, the same controlled movement that kept everything predictable, but his voice stopped me before I could take more than a single step. "Hannah." My name sounded different in his voice, not unfamiliar, but more certain than it should have been, like he had known it longer than a few hours, and I turned before I could stop myself, that same instinctive reaction I had been trying to control all night. "Yes," I asked, keeping the question neutral, professional, but there was a slight edge to it now, something I could not quite smooth out, something that came from the way this night had already shifted beyond what I was used to handling. He studied me for a moment, not long, not dramatic, just long enough to make me aware of it, and then his gaze dropped briefly, not to my wrist this time, but to my hand where it rested lightly against the tray, still, controlled, and when he looked back up, there was something different there, not softer, not warmer, just more decided. "You are leaving at 10, he said, and I blinked once, the statement catching me off guard because it was not a question, not even close, it was presented like a fact, like something already set, and for a second I did not know how to respond because that was not how this worked, not in my world, not in my job, not in anything I had control over. "My shift ends at 11, I replied, the words coming out automatically, because that was the truth, because that was the schedule posted on the wall in the back, because that was what I had planned around, what I relied on, what made sense. He did not react, did not argue, just held my gaze with that same steady focus, like my answer had not changed anything, like it had simply been noted and set aside. "Tonight, it ends at 10, he said, just as calmly, just as certain, and something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that he was not making a suggestion, he was stating a decision. "I cannot just leave early," I said, the words firmer now, because this was something I understood, something I could push back on, something that still belonged to me, and for a second I thought that would be enough, that drawing that line would reset the balance, bring things back into something familiar, something manageable. But he did not push, did not insist, did not argue, he simply watched me for a moment longer, and then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he shifted his attention to Marco, who was moving behind the bar, calling out orders, unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. "You can," he said quietly, his gaze returning to mine, and there was something in his tone that made the words feel heavier than they should have, more certain, more final, like the decision had already been made somewhere beyond this table, somewhere I could not see or influence. For a second, I did not respond, could not, because something in me understood that arguing further would not change anything, not in the way I expected it to, and that realization settled into my chest with a weight that felt both unsettling and strangely steady at the same time. I stepped back slowly, my grip tightening slightly on the tray as I forced myself to move, to return to the rhythm of the shift, to the normalcy I had been trying to hold onto all night, but it felt different now, everything felt different, like the boundaries I had relied on were shifting in ways I did not fully understand. And as I moved through the dining room, as the minutes passed and the clock edged closer to 10, I found myself checking the time more often than I should have, not because I wanted the shift to end, but because I had a growing sense that when it did, something else would begin, something I was not entirely prepared for, something I was not sure I could stop. By the time the clock on the wall behind the bar read 9:47, I had already checked it 6 times, each glance quick, almost accidental, but not really, because now every minute felt like it mattered in a way it had not before, like time itself had shifted from something I moved through to something I was counting down without fully understanding why. The restaurant was still busy, the usual Friday night rhythm holding steady, plates moving, glasses clinking, conversations blending into a low, constant hum, but underneath it all, there was a tension I could not shake, something quiet and persistent that seemed to follow me from one table to the next. I avoided looking at him as much as I could, focusing instead on everything else, on the details that usually kept me grounded, but it did not work the way I wanted it to, because even without looking, I could feel it, that awareness, that steady presence that had not faded since the moment he walked in, and now it felt sharper, more deliberate, like he was not just waiting anymore, like he already knew how this night was going to end. My phone remained silent, completely still in my apron pocket, and that should have been a relief. It should have made things easier, but instead it made everything feel more uncertain, because silence like this never lasted without a reason, never came without something behind it, and I could not stop thinking about the way he had said it, like it was already decided, like it was not something I needed to question. "You are off in 10 minutes, right?" Maria asked as she passed me near the kitchen, her tone casual, unaware of how that simple question landed heavier than it should have, and I hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding, because arguing with that now felt pointless, because part of me already knew that whether I agreed or not did not seem to matter anymore. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice light, normal, even though nothing about this felt normal, not anymore, not after everything that had already happened in the span of a single shift. I finished my last table carefully, double-checking everything, making sure there was nothing left undone, nothing that could give anyone a reason to call me back, because if I was leaving early, I was going to do it right, I was going to leave clean, without questions, without complications, because that was the only way I knew how to manage situations that felt like they were slipping out of my control. At 9:58, I stepped into the back, untied my apron, folded it neatly the way I always did, placed it on the shelf with the others, and for a second I just stood there, staring at it like it meant something more than it did, like leaving it behind marked a shift I was not ready to name yet. "You heading out?" Marco asked from across the room, not looking up from the order sheet in his hand, and I nodded, forcing a small smile that he did not even see. "Yeah, early night," I replied, the words feeling strange as I said them, because early nights were not something I was used to, not something I relied on, not something that usually came without a reason attached to it. He gave a distracted nod, already moving on to the next thing, and just like that, there were no questions, no hesitation, nothing to stop me from leaving, and somehow that felt more unsettling than if there had been resistance, because it made everything feel too easy, too smooth, like something had been arranged without me fully understanding how. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked toward the back exit, each step slower than it should have been, not because I did not want to leave, but because I was not sure what I was walking into when I did. The door opened with a soft click, and the cool night air hit me immediately, sharp and grounding, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed through earlier, leaving the pavement slightly damp under the streetlights. For a second, I just stood there, letting the quiet settle around me, letting the absence of noise from inside the restaurant create a space that felt almost unreal after the constant hum I had been surrounded by for hours. My phone remained silent. No calls. No messages. Just that same stillness that had been there for nearly an hour now, and I did not know what to do with it, did not know how to trust it, did not know how long it would last. "You are right on time." His voice came from my left, calm, steady, exactly where I should have expected it, and I turned slowly, not startled this time, not surprised, because part of me had known he would be here, had known this moment was coming the second he told me my shift would end early. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but deliberate, like he had been waiting, like this was exactly where he intended to be all along, and the distance between us felt different out here, more defined, but no less controlled. "You planned this," I said, the words quieter than I intended, more observation than accusation, because it felt obvious now, too many things had lined up too perfectly for it to be anything else. He did not deny it, did not confirm it either, just watched me with that same steady gaze, like the answer was not something that needed to be spoken out loud. "You should not go home tonight," he said instead, his tone unchanged, but the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they reached beyond this moment, beyond this street, into something that felt far more personal than anything I had allowed before. I tightened my grip on my bag strap, the motion small but grounding, something to hold on to as I processed what he had just said, because that was not a suggestion, not really, it was something else entirely, something that carried an implication I was not ready to fully face. That is not your decision, I replied, the words firmer now, because this was a line I understood, a boundary I knew how to defend, even if everything else tonight had blurred beyond recognition. For a second, he said nothing, just held my gaze, and then he stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make his next words impossible to ignore. It becomes my decision when your safety is involved, he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made my breath catch again, not because of the words themselves, but because of the certainty behind them, the way he spoke like it was already settled, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this conversation. I shook my head slightly, the motion more reflex than thought, because I did not know how to respond to that, did not know how to fit it into the version of my life I had been trying to maintain, the version where I handled my own problems, where I kept things contained, where I did not rely on someone else to step in, no matter how certain they seemed. You do not even know where I live, I said, reaching for something practical, something that grounded the conversation in reality, but the moment the words left my mouth, I knew it was a mistake, because his expression did not change, did not falter, just held that same quiet certainty that had followed him all night. I know enough, he said again, and this time, the words settled differently, heavier, more final, like they carried more weight than I was ready to acknowledge. The street around us remained quiet, the distant sound of traffic a low hum in the background, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the next step had not yet been taken, like the night was holding its breath. And standing there, with him watching me like he already knew the outcome, I realized something I had been trying to ignore since the moment this shift began. This was no longer just about getting through the night, it was about what came after, and whether I was ready for it or not, that part was already beginning. I should have said no right then, should have stepped back, turned around, walked to my car, and driven home like nothing had changed, like tonight had been just another shift, just another series of moments I could leave behind the second I stepped out the door, but my feet did not move, and that hesitation said more than anything else I could have replied with. The air felt colder now, or maybe I was just more aware of it, the way it brushed against my skin, the way it carried the quiet of the street around us, empty except for the occasional car passing in the distance, headlights sweeping briefly across the pavement before disappearing again. I am fine, I said finally, because it was the only response I had practiced, the only one that had ever worked before, the one that kept things from escalating, the one that kept everything contained within lines I understood. His expression did not change, but there was a shift in his gaze, something subtle, something that made it clear he did not believe me, and more importantly, that he was not going to pretend to. You are not, he replied, just as calmly, just as certain, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because there was no argument in his tone, no challenge, just a statement that landed like it had already been proven. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to look away for a moment, to break the weight of that gaze, because standing there under it felt like being read too clearly, like every carefully constructed piece of control I had built was being stripped away one layer at a time. You cannot just decide things for me, I said, my voice quieter now, less firm than I wanted it to be, because part of me already knew he was not asking for permission, part of me had seen that from the moment he walked into the restaurant, from the moment everything around him seemed to adjust without needing to be told. He did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough for me to feel it settle into something heavier, something more deliberate, until he finally spoke again, his voice lower now, closer, though I had not noticed him step any nearer. I am not deciding for you, he said, and for a second I almost believed that was true, almost let that statement soften the edge of everything else, until he added, just as evenly, I am removing the options that are not safe. The words hit differently, not louder, not sharper, just more precise, like they had been chosen carefully, like they were meant to land exactly where they did, and I felt something shift again, something small but undeniable, because this was not how anyone had ever spoken to me before, not with this kind of certainty, not with this kind of quiet control. My phone remained silent in my hand, still, unchanged, and I realized then how much that absence mattered, how much it altered the balance of everything else, because without it, without the constant interruptions, the constant reminders, I had nothing to deflect with, nothing to hide behind, just this moment, just this conversation, just him. What does that even mean? I asked, the question coming out softer than I intended, because I was not sure I wanted the answer, not sure I was ready for whatever it implied. He watched me for a moment, and then his gaze shifted briefly past me, toward the street, scanning in a way that felt automatic, practiced, before returning to me with that same steady focus. It means you do not go back to a place where someone thinks they can treat you like that, he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, not because they were loud, not because they were forceful, but because they were direct, because they named something I had spent so much time trying to minimize, trying to explain away, trying to keep small enough that it did not define anything beyond itself. I tightened my grip on my bag again, grounding myself in the physical sensation, because the alternative was letting those words sink in too deeply, letting them expand into something I could not control. You do not understand, I said, the words coming faster now, more defensive, because this was the part one knew, the part one could push back on, the part that still belonged to me. It is not that simple. He did not argue, did not interrupt, just let me speak, which somehow made it harder, because there was no resistance to push against, no reaction to anchor my own, just that same steady attention that seemed to absorb everything without needing to respond immediately. It is exactly that simple, he said after a moment, his tone unchanged, and something about the way he said it made my breath catch again, because it challenged everything I had convinced myself was true, everything I had used to justify staying, to justify handling things the way I always had. I shook my head again, the motion sharper this time, because I needed to hold on to something, needed to keep this from becoming something I could not step away from. You cannot fix this, I said, and there was something in my voice now, something closer to truth than anything I had said before, because this was not something that could be solved in a single night, not something that could be undone by one conversation, no matter how certain he sounded. His gaze did not waver, and when he spoke again, his voice was just as calm, just as controlled, but there was something else there now, something deeper, something that settled into my chest in a way I could not easily ignore. I am not trying to fix it, he said, and for a second I did not understand, until he continued, his eyes holding mine with a certainty that made everything else fade slightly. At the edges, I am making sure it stops. The words hung there between us, quiet but absolute, and I felt it again, that shift, that subtle, undeniable movement of something changing beneath the surface, because this was no longer just about what had already happened, it was about what would happen next, about what he was willing to do to ensure it, and standing there in the cool night air, with the city moving quietly around us and his presence steady and unyielding in front of me, I realized something I had been trying to avoid since. The moment he stepped into my world, this was not something I could control anymore, and whether I was ready for it or not, he had already decided he was not going to walk away. I should have stepped back after that, should have drawn a line so clear that even he would not cross it, but something about the way he said it stayed with me, not loud, not forceful, just certain in a way that made everything else feel less solid, less reliable, like the rules I had been following no longer applied in the same way. The streetlight above us flickered once, briefly, casting a shifting glow across the pavement, and I became aware of how still everything felt, how quiet the night had settled around us, like the city itself had paused just enough for this moment to stretch longer than it should have. You cannot control everything, I said, the word softer now, less defensive, because part of me already knew that control was not what this was about, not entirely, and yet it was the only way I knew how to frame it, the only way I knew how to push back against something that felt bigger than I was prepared for. He did not react the way I expected, did not dismiss it, did not challenge it, just watched me with that same steady focus that had not changed since the beginning of the night, like he was letting me reach whatever conclusion I needed to on my own. No, he said after a moment, his voice calm, grounded, but I control what happens around me. The simplicity of it made my chest tighten again, because there was no arrogance in it, no exaggeration, just a statement that felt like it had already been proven. In ways I had only just started to notice. My phone remained silent, still tucked in my hand, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I realized I was not waiting for it to light up anymore, not checking it, not anticipating the next interruption, and that absence felt different now, less like something temporary and more like something that had already shifted the balance of everything else. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me heavier than it should have, and for a second I let myself look at him fully, not just in quick glances, not just in fragments, but directly, taking in the details I had been avoiding all night, the way he stood, composed but ready, the way his attention never seemed to scatter, never drift, always focused exactly where he intended it to be. And what happens next? I asked, because that was the part one could not ignore anymore, the part that had been building since the moment he stepped into my shift, the part that had followed me out here into the quiet of the street. He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt intentional, like he was measuring the question, considering it in a way that made it matter more than I expected it to, and when he finally spoke, his voice was just as steady, just as controlled as before, but there was something else there now, something that made the words land differently. "That depends on you," he said, and for a second I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like the first time all night that something had been placed back in my hands, even if only partially, even if I was not entirely sure how much of it was real. "That does not sound like you," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them, because everything else he had said, everything else he had done, had pointed in the opposite direction, toward decisions already made, toward outcomes already set. He held my gaze, unbothered by the challenge in my tone, and for a moment the silence between us shifted again, not heavy this time, not tense, just quiet, like something was being acknowledged without needing to be spoken out loud. "I decide the parts that matter," he said finally, and there it was again, that certainty, that quiet control that seemed to define everything about him, and I felt it settle into me in a way I could not ignore, because whether I agreed with it or not, whether I accepted it or not, it was already shaping the situation I found myself in. I looked away briefly, toward the street, toward the distant glow of headlights passing at the end of the block, trying to ground myself in something outside of this moment, something familiar, something I could understand, but it did not work the way I wanted it to, because everything kept pulling back here, back to him, back to the way this night had unfolded in a direction I had not chosen. "I have a place," I said after a moment, the words slower now, more deliberate, because saying them felt like drawing a line, like reasserting something I still believed I had control over. "I can go home." He did not interrupt, did not dismiss it, just listened, which somehow made it harder to continue, because there was no resistance, no immediate contradiction, just space for the words to exist. "And tomorrow?" he asked quietly, and that single question shifted everything again, because it reached beyond the immediate, beyond the simple act of getting through the night, into something larger, something ongoing, something I had been trying not to think about. I hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough for him to see it, enough for me to feel it, that small crack in the certainty I had been trying to hold on to. "I will figure it out," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt thinner than they should have, less solid, like something I had said too many times before without it actually changing anything. He nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging it, and then he stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd me, not enough to take away the space entirely, but enough to make his next words land with a weight I could not ignore. "You have been figuring it out for a while," he said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something that made it feel less like an observation and more like a conclusion, and I felt my chest tighten again, because he was not wrong, because that was the part I had been avoiding, the part one had been minimizing, the part one had been telling myself was temporary, manageable, under control. I swallowed, my grip tightening on my bag strap again, and for a second I did not know what to say, because there was no easy answer to that, no simple way to push it aside. "So what are you saying?" I asked finally, my voice quieter now, because I needed to hear it clearly, needed to understand exactly what he meant, exactly where this was going. He held my gaze, steady and unwavering, and when he spoke, the words were just as calm as everything else he had said, but they carried a weight that settled into the space between us like something final. "I am saying you do not go back to something that has already proven it will not change," he said, and for a moment, everything else faded, the street, the quiet, the distance, leaving just that statement hanging between us, and I realized then that this was not just about tonight anymore, not just about where I went next, but about whether I was willing to accept that the life I had been trying to manage was not as stable as I had convinced myself it was, and standing there in the dim light, with his presence steady and unyielding in front of me, I understood something that made everything shift just slightly out of alignment. This was not just a choice about where I would sleep tonight, it was a choice about whether I was ready to stop pretending things would fix themselves if I just held on long enough. I did not answer him right away because there was nothing simple left to say, nothing easy to reach for that would keep this from becoming something bigger than I was ready for, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, feeling the weight of everything he had just said settle into places I had been avoiding for far too long. The street light above us hummed faintly, steady and constant, and I focused on that for a second, on something predictable, something that did not shift or change depending on what I chose next, because everything else suddenly felt like it did. "You make it sound easy," I said finally, my voice quieter now, not defensive anymore, just honest in a way I had not allowed myself to be all night, because the truth was it was not easy, it had never been easy, and pretending it was had only made it harder to face. He did not interrupt, did not correct me, just watched, giving me the space to continue if I wanted to, and for the first time since this conversation started, I realized he was not rushing me, not forcing the next step, just holding the direction steady, like he knew I would eventually have to decide on my own. "It is not just walking away," I added, the words coming slower now, more deliberate, because saying them out loud made them real in a way that thinking them never quite did. "It is everything that comes after." He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, but it was enough to show he understood what I meant, enough to show he was not dismissing it as something simple or small. "Yes," he said, and the single word landed differently than I expected, not minimizing, not simplifying, just acknowledging, and somehow that made it easier to breathe, even if only slightly. I looked down at my hands for a second, at the way my fingers curled slightly around the strap of my bag, at the faint tremor I had been trying to ignore all night, and I realized I was tired, not just from the shift, not just from standing for hours under bright lights and constant noise, but from everything else, from the constant calculation, the constant adjustment, the constant effort it took to keep things contained, to keep things from becoming something worse. "I have responsibilities," I said, the words almost automatic, something I had said before in different ways, to myself more than anyone else, a reason, a justification, something that made staying feel necessary, even when it did not feel right. He did not react immediately, and when I looked back up, his gaze had not softened, had not changed in any obvious way, but there was something in it now, something that felt more focused, more intentional, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "You also have a responsibility to yourself," he said, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from pressure, not from force, but from recognition, because that was the part one had been setting aside, the part one had been minimizing, the part one had convinced myself could wait. I shook my head slightly, the motion small, uncertain, because it was easier to argue against that, easier to push back on something that felt too close to the truth. "That is not how it works," I said. But even as I spoke, I could hear the lack of certainty in my own voice, could feel the way the words did not land as firmly as I wanted them to, because part of me already knew that maybe it should work that way, maybe it had always been supposed to. He did not argue again, did not try to convince me further, and that in itself felt like a shift, because it meant he had already said what he needed to, already set the direction without needing to repeat it. "Then tell me how it works," he said instead, his tone calm, open in a way that caught me off guard, because it was not a challenge, not a demand, just a question, one that placed the answer back in my hands. I hesitated, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, less heavy, more expectant, like I was standing at the edge of something I had been avoiding for a long time. "You keep things balanced," I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them, because I had never really said them out loud before. "You make sure nothing gets too far out of control, you manage it, you adapt, I trailed off the sentence and finished, because saying it like that made it sound smaller than it felt, made it sound like something manageable, something reasonable, when I knew it was not always that simple. He watched me closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting the words settle, and for a second I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, what conclusions he had already drawn, what decisions he had already made. "And has that worked?" he asked quietly, and the question landed harder than anything else he had said, not because it was loud, not because it was forceful, but because it cut straight through everything else, through the explanations, through the justifications, through the careful way I had been framing things all night. I did not answer right away, because the truth was there, obvious and unavoidable, and saying it out loud felt like crossing a line I could not step back from. My grip tightened on my bag strap again, the motion grounding, familiar, and I looked away briefly, toward the street, toward anything that was not him, not this moment, not this question that demanded more honesty than I was used to giving. Not always, I admitted finally, the words quiet, almost lost in the space between us, but they were enough to shift something, enough to make the reality of it settle in a way that could not be ignored. He nodded once, not in agreement, not in judgment, just acknowledgement, and then he stepped slightly closer again, the movement deliberate but not forceful, just enough to bring his voice lower, more direct. Then you change the way it works, he said, and the simplicity of it should have felt unrealistic, should have felt like something easier said than done, but the way he said it made it sound possible, made it sound like a decision instead of an obstacle. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in my chest shift slightly, not disappear, not resolve, just change shape, and for the first time since this night began, I realized something that felt both unsettling and steady at the same time. I was no longer just reacting to what was happening, I was being asked to choose what happened next, and standing there under the dim light, with him watching me like the outcome already mattered, I understood that whatever I decided now would not just end this moment, it would define everything that came after. I stood there with his words still settling into me, feeling the quiet weight of them linger in a way that did not fade the way most conversations did, because this was not just a passing moment, not something I could file away and move on from, it was something that pressed forward, something that demanded a response even if I was not ready to give one yet. The night around us felt still again, the distant hum of traffic steady but far away, like it belonged to a different world than the one I was standing in now, and for the first time, I realized I was not thinking about getting back to my car, not calculating the quickest route home, not planning the usual steps I took to keep everything predictable, and that absence felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. You make it sound like I can just decide and everything changes, I said after a moment, my voice quieter now, not defensive, not sharp, just uncertain in a way I had not allowed myself to be before, because uncertainty meant acknowledging that what I had been doing was not working the way I had convinced myself it was. He did not move, did not interrupt, just watched me with that same steady attention that had not wavered since the beginning of the night, like he was not waiting for the right answer, just for the real one. Things do not change all at once, he replied, his tone even, grounded, but the direction does. The way he said it made something in my chest shift again, something subtle but undeniable, because it reframed everything in a way I had not considered, not as an immediate solution, not as a sudden fix, but as a starting point, something that could alter what came next without needing to resolve everything at once. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me heavier than it should have, and I looked down for a second, at the pavement beneath my feet, at the faint reflection of the streetlight in the damp surface, grounding myself in something tangible, something real, because everything else felt like it was moving in ways I could not fully track. And if I choose wrong, I asked quietly, because that was the part that always stopped me, the part that kept me in place even when I knew something was off, the fear that stepping away would only make things worse, that the consequences would be bigger than what I was already dealing with. He did not hesitate this time, did not pause to consider, his answer immediate, certain. Then you adjust, he said, like it was simple, like it was obvious, like it was something I had always had the ability to do even if I had not been using it that way. I let out a small breath that almost felt like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, just a quiet recognition of how different that perspective was from the one I had been holding onto. You say that like it is easy, I said. And this time there was no edge to it, no resistance, just an observation, because I could see the logic in what he was saying even if I did not fully trust it yet. It is not easy, he replied, and there was something in his voice now, something slightly deeper, not softer, but more deliberate, like he was choosing to meet me where I was instead of pulling me further ahead, but it is necessary. The word settled into me in a way that made it hard to ignore, because it did not leave room for delay, did not allow for the kind of waiting I had been relying on, the kind of hoping that things would shift on their own if I just gave them enough time. I looked back up at him, really looked this time, not just at the surface, not just at the composed exterior, but at the way he held himself, the way his attention never wavered, the way he spoke like decisions were things you made and then followed through on, not things you circled around indefinitely. Why do you care? I asked, because that was still the part one could not fully reconcile, the part that did not fit neatly into anything I understood, because people did not step into situations like this without a reason, without something driving it, and I needed to know what that was, needed something to anchor this in reality. He did not answer immediately, and for a second I wondered if he would deflect, if he would avoid it the way I had avoided so many things tonight. But when he spoke, his voice was just as steady, just as controlled as before, with that same quiet certainty that had defined everything else. "Because I noticed," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not complicated, not layered, just direct, like that alone was enough of a reason. I frowned slightly, the reaction automatic, because that did not feel like enough, not for the way he had inserted himself into this, not for the way he had already changed things without asking. "People notice things all the time," I said, the words coming a little quicker now, because I needed to understand the difference, needed to know why he had not just seen it and moved on the way most people did. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, just held mine with that same unwavering focus, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something new, something that made the words land with more weight than before. "Most people look away," he said quietly, and that was it, that was the difference, that was the line he had drawn without needing to explain it further, and I felt it settle into me in a way that was harder to dismiss than anything else he had said tonight, because it was true, because I had seen it before, because I had relied on it more times than I wanted to admit. I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly on my bag again, and for a moment I did not know what to say, because there was no easy response to that, no simple way to push it aside. The street remained quiet around us, the night stretching on in that same still, steady way, and I realized then that the moment I had been avoiding had already arrived, that the decision he had been leading me toward was no longer something I could delay. "If I do this," I said slowly, the words forming carefully, deliberately, because they mattered more than anything I had said so far, "if I choose something different," I trailed off, not because I did not know how to finish the sentence, but because finishing it made it real in a way I was still adjusting to. He stepped just slightly closer, not enough to close the space entirely, just enough to make his presence feel more immediate, more grounded, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more direct, but no less controlled. "Then you do not do it alone," he said, and the words landed in a way I had not expected, not heavy, not overwhelming, just steady, like something being offered without pressure, without demand, and for a second, I just stood there, feeling the shift in that statement, the way it changed the shape of everything that came before it, because this was not just about walking away anymore, it was about what came after, about whether I was willing to step into something unknown with someone who had already proven he was not going to look away. And standing there in the quiet of the night, with his gaze steady on mine and the city moving on around us like nothing had changed, I realized something that felt both unfamiliar and undeniable. For the first time in a long time, the idea of not handling everything on my own did not feel like weakness, it felt like a possibility. I did not realize I had been holding my breath until it left me slowly, quietly, like something I had been carrying without noticing was finally easing just enough to feel the difference, and his words stayed with me, not loud, not overwhelming, just steady, like they had found a place to settle whether I was ready for them or not. Not alone. The idea should have felt foreign, uncomfortable, something to reject on instinct, but it did not entirely, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, because it meant something in me had already shifted before I had consciously decided to let it. I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at the presence, not just at the control he carried so effortlessly, but at the way he stood there without pushing closer, without forcing the next step, like he had already said enough, like the rest was mine to choose. "You do not even know what you are stepping into," I said, the words quieter now, not a warning exactly, but something close, because this was not simple, it was not clean, it was not something that could be solved by one decision or one night, and part of me needed him to understand that, needed him to see that this was more complicated than it looked from the outside. His expression did not change, not in any obvious way, but there was something in his gaze, something that suggested he had already considered that, already weighed it, already decided it did not change his position. "I know enough to know you should not handle it the way you have been," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just that same quiet certainty that had followed him through every word, every action since the moment he walked into my shift. I shook my head slightly, the motion slower this time, less about rejecting what he said and more about trying to process it, trying to fit it into something that made sense, something that did not feel like I was stepping off solid ground into something I could not see. "You keep saying that like it is obvious," I said, and there was a hint of something else in my voice now, something closer to vulnerability than I was used to allowing, because the truth was, it was not obvious to me, not after everything I had been telling myself, not after everything I had been trying to manage on my own. He did not respond immediately, and the silence that followed felt different again, not heavy, not tense, just thoughtful, like he was considering something beyond the immediate conversation, something that reached further than the moment we were standing in. "It is obvious from the outside," he said finally, his tone even, measured, "but I know it is not from where you are standing." The words settled into me in a way that made it harder to push back, because they acknowledged something I had been feeling but had not put into words, that difference between how things looked and how they actually felt, that gap between what seemed clear and what felt complicated when you were the one inside it. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders easing just slightly as I let that sink in, and for a moment I allowed myself to stand there without trying to fill the space, without trying to control the direction of the conversation, because maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe I had been trying to manage everything so tightly that I had not given myself room to see it clearly. "If I leave," I said after a moment, the words deliberate, careful, because they mattered now in a way they had not before, "it does not just end there." I paused, not because I did not know what came next, but because saying it out loud made it real, made it something I could not take back once it was spoken. "He will not just disappear," I added, my voice quieter now, more honest, because that was the part one could not ignore, the part that had always kept me in place, the part that made walking away feel like stepping into something unpredictable. He watched me closely as I spoke, his attention steady, unwavering, and when I finished, he did not dismiss it, did not minimize it, just let the words settle before responding. "He already lost control tonight," he said, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from fear, not exactly, but from the recognition in it, from the truth I could not fully deny, even if I had not wanted to admit it. My phone had been silent for hours now, something that had never happened before, something that should have felt temporary, but now felt like a shift I could not ignore. "And that changes things," he continued, his voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying a weight that made the words land deeper than anything else he had said, because they pointed to something already in motion, something that had already begun to shift whether I acknowledged it or not. I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly on my bag again, and for a moment I did not know what to say, because he was right, because something had changed tonight, something I had not planned, something I had not controlled, and now I was standing in the middle of it trying to decide what came next. "So what are you saying?" I asked, my voice softer now, not challenging, not defensive, just searching, because I needed to understand the full weight of what he was offering, what he was suggesting, what he had already decided. He stepped slightly closer again, just enough to make his presence feel more immediate, more grounded, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more direct, but no less steady. "I am saying you do not go back to the same situation and expect a different outcome," he said, and the words settled into the space between us like something final, something that could not be reshaped or softened. I looked at him for a long moment, letting that settle, letting everything from tonight line up in a way it had not before, the silence of my phone, the way my shift had ended early without resistance, the way he had stepped into a situation I had been managing alone for too long, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had been avoiding since the beginning. "And if I choose not to go back," I said slowly, the words careful, deliberate, because this was the line, the moment everything shifted from possibility to decision, what happens then? He did not hesitate this time, his answer. Immediate, certain, and steady in a way that made everything else fall quiet around it. "Then you move forward," he said, and there was something in his tone, something unspoken but clear, that made the words feel like more than just direction, more than just advice, something that carried an implication I could not ignore. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of that moment settle into something real, something tangible, and for the first time since this night began, I realized the choice in front of me was no longer about avoiding what I had been dealing with, it was about deciding whether I was ready to step into something different, something uncertain, but possibly better than what I was leaving behind. For a long moment, I did not move, did not speak, did not even look away, because everything had led to this exact point, this quiet space between what I had been holding onto and what I could choose instead, and the weight of it settled into me in a way that felt both unfamiliar and strangely clear at the same time. The night air felt colder now, or maybe I was just more aware of it, the way it wrapped around me, grounding me in something real while everything else felt like it was shifting just beneath the surface. I thought about the apartment I would have gone back to, the silence that never stayed silent for long, the careful steps, the measured words, the constant awareness of what might happen next, and for the first time, I did not push those thoughts away, did not minimize them, did not tell myself they were temporary or manageable or something I could keep balancing if I just tried hard enough. I let them sit there, fully, honestly, and that honesty changed something, even if it was only a small shift. I cannot pretend it will fix itself anymore, I said quietly, the words steady in a way I had not expected, because saying them out loud made them real, made them something I could not take back, and for a second, that felt like stepping off something solid, like letting go of something I had relied on even if it had never really held me the way I needed it to. He did not react immediately, did not interrupt, just watched me with that same steady attention. Like he understood exactly what that admission meant, like he recognized it for what it was, not weakness, not uncertainty, but a decision starting to take shape. I took a slow breath, feeling the air fill my lungs in a way that felt different, less tight, less restricted, and I realized I was not as afraid of this moment as I thought I would be, not in the way I had been afraid of everything else. So I am not going back tonight, I added, the words quieter but no less certain, and as soon as I said them, something settled into place, something that felt like a line being drawn not just in this moment, but in everything that came after it. The street remained quiet around us, the city continuing on in the distance like nothing had changed, but for me, everything had, even if it was not visible yet, even if it was only the beginning of something I did not fully understand. He nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging it like he had expected this outcome all along, and for the first time since he stepped into my world, that did not feel unsettling. It felt steady, like something I could stand on instead of something pulling me off balance. Good, he said simply, and there was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just quiet approval, like the decision itself mattered more than anything else. I looked at him for a moment longer, taking in the way he stood there, composed, certain, the way he had guided this entire night without forcing it, without rushing it, and I realized something I had not fully understood until now. He had not been trying to take control away from me, he had been pushing me to take it back. This does not mean I am not figuring things out on my own, I said, because that still mattered, still needed to be said, and my voice was steadier now, more grounded, because this was no longer about resisting him, it was about defining where I stood within all of it. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and then he gave a slight nod, the movement subtle but clear. It means you are choosing better, he replied, and the word settled into me in a way that felt right, not overwhelming, not heavy, just clear, like something I could carry without it weighing me down. For a second, neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer tense, no longer uncertain, just calm, like the moment had reached its natural end. What happens now? I asked, not because I was unsure anymore, but because I needed to hear it, needed to understand what came next in a way that matched the decision I had just made. He glanced briefly toward the street, then back at me, his expression unchanged but his presence steady in a way that felt grounding instead of overwhelming. Now you come with me, he said, his voice calm, direct, leaving no room for confusion, but this time it did not feel like a command, it felt like an option, one I could accept or refuse without losing myself in the process. I considered it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be sure, wanted this next step to be as deliberate as the decision I had just made, and then I nodded, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than anything else I had done tonight. As I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, I realized something that stayed with me even as the night continued, even as everything else began to shift around it. He might have been the one who saw what I was trying to hide, but I was the one who chose to stop hiding it, and somehow, that made all the difference.